Our scripture's found on page 534 in the Pew Bible. We're going to read Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with two he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me.
So there was a time in my life when I believed wholeheartedly a very powerful and transcendent myth. At the heart of this myth was this belief that I was absolutely amazing at ultimate frisbee. Anybody ultimate frisbee? Yeah, it's kind of like a cross between football and soccer. You throw the frisbee to your teammates. You try to throw it down into the end zone. Well, I came to believe that I was absolutely unbelievable at ultimate frisbee because whenever I played, honestly, I totally dominated. I mean, literally, I could throw the frisbee farther than anybody else. I would get into the end zone. They'd throw it up there. I would jump up. I would tower over everybody else. I would grab the frisbee. I never lost at ultimate frisbee. So for many, many years, I had come to believe this powerful and transcendent myth that I was incredible at ultimate frisbee. And then one day, I had a reality check. And what I discovered is that the reason why I had come to believe I was so good at ultimate frisbee is because the only time I ever played was with 5th and 6th graders. The only time I ever played, I was a counselor at this church camp, right? People don't play ultimate frisbee that much. The only time I played, I was a counselor in high school and college for this youth camp, 5th and 6th graders, where I just crushed those kids at ultimate frisbee. And then one day I got together in college and I played with people my own age. And it was a reality check. How many of us can relate to that? How many of us have had an experience where all of a sudden you had a reality check? Today we are kicking off a brand new series, a series called Pivot. The central theme of this series is that when you encounter the presence of God, if you have a genuine encounter with the presence of God, it will compel you to pivot. It will compel you to make changes in your life. This series really falls on the heels of the series we just finished. The series during the season of Epiphany, a season in which we're encouraged to celebrate the reality of the kingdom of heaven, that with the coming of Jesus in the story of Christmas with the coming of Jesus, and then the story of his ministry, his earthly ministry, where he demonstrated that the power of the kingdom of heaven was available for the taking, right? This was a series in which I encouraged you to reflect on the fact that the power of God is available for you, that you can tap into it, that you can come to know and experience the presence of God. Well, this series flows out of that, just like the season of Lent, which we are now entering into, naturally flows out of the season of Epiphany. Epiphany is a season. It's a word that just means to manifest and points to the reality that in Jesus, God manifested his presence to the world. And when you come to experience the presence of God, when you come to know him, it compels you to pivot. It compels you to make changes in your life. So really, the name of this series could be Repent. But I didn't pick that for the title of this series. It's a little bit of a churchy word. It's a word that maybe has some baggage for some people. But pivot really means the same thing. Because what it means to repent is to turn away from wherever you've been going, to recognize ways in which you need to make changes in your life, to pivot. That's what repent means. And so throughout this series, I'm going to be encouraging you. I'm going to be saying, if you have come to know the power of the presence of God, then in what ways is God leading you to pivot, to make changes in your life? And of course, this is precisely what we see in this passage that was just read. It begins with, you see, Isaiah encountering the presence of God. Isaiah has an epiphany. He comes to see the manifestation of the power and the presence of God. And we'll see that it leads him to pivot. It leads him to make changes. So we'll begin here with how the story begins. He encounters the presence of God. Let me reread for you the first 4 verses of this passage. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. You see, Isaiah has this powerful encounter with the power and the presence of God. Now, the first thing I want to highlight here is that it kind of starts off sort of weird here. Isaiah here, really what he's doing is he's sort of telling us his testimony, right? You know, when you have an encounter with God and then you tell people about it, it's sort of a testimony that you give, your testimony, right? And that's kind of what Isaiah is doing here, but the way he starts his testimony is a little weird, right? He starts off by saying, in the year that King Uzziah died. Now, isn't that a little weird? Kind of a weird way to start your testimony? I mean, I have a testimony from when I came to know the Lord. When I had an encounter with the presence of God. I was about 11 or 12 years old. I was at a church camp, and over the years, I've told that testimony over and over again. But I'll tell you what, I've never said this. I've never said, in the 3rd year of Ronald Reagan's 2nd term, I saw the Lord. That's when it took place. I mean, that would just be weird, right? Why does he say in the year that King Uzziah died? Why is this central to his testimony? Well, to understand this, we've got to set this passage within its historical context. Uzziah was the king of Judah, the southern kingdom. Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms at this point. This is in the late 8th century BC. You had Judah in the south, you had Samaria in the north, and Uzziah was the king of the south. Now, Uzziah happened to be a really good king. Well, at least he was a good king in, I guess you might say, in terms of the economy, right? And you know, that's what makes a good king, right? It's about the economy, stupid, right? Isn't that what they always say in election year? It's about the economy. Well, he did wonders for the economy. He was able to expand the borders of Judah militarily. He expanded to the west, to the south, to the east, and he managed to lead the kingdom of Judah into a season of prosperity. And so when he died, this was a sad moment for the people of Israel, for the people of Judah in southern Israel. Now, it wasn't just a sad time because Uzziah died. At the very same time in which he died, somewhat coincidentally, the kingdom of Assyria was on the rise. And so Judah had had this brief period of prosperity, which they knew was going to come to an end. As the Assyrian power grew, they began to spread to the west, coming closer and closer to Judah, and this big dark cloud loomed over them. And sure enough, as history would prove to be the case, that over the next 40 years, things just got worse and worse and worse. Within 20 years of when Uzziah died, the northern kingdom would be completely conquered and wiped out by the Assyrians. And within 40 years of when King Uzziah died, the city of Jerusalem in Judah would be laid to siege by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. So this marks a dark period that they were entering into. So Isaiah has this incredible encounter with God right at the beginning of this very dark period in the life of the people of Judah. And I think that from that, an important principle emerges for us about God. And here's what it is. God comes for us in our darkest hour. God comes for us in our darkest hour. We find this throughout the Bible. This is not an isolated case where we find this happening. Next week, we're going to be looking at a passage in the book of Exodus. And of course, in the book of Exodus, we read about the people of Israel having a powerful experience with the presence of God. We read about the tabernacle. We're going to be looking at how God instructed them to build this tent of meeting, so that he could come and dwell with them. And we read about the cloud of his glory coming and dwelling in their midst, a cloud by day, a fire by night. We read, of course, about the power and the presence of God coming upon them on Mount Sinai and God speaking to them, right? They have this incredible experience with the power and the presence of God. And when does this take place? When does God reveal himself to them? It's in their darkest hour. It's when they are crying out to him from slavery in Egypt. That's when he comes to them. Of course, we look at the story of Jesus, which is paradigmatic for our entire understanding of God. And what do we discover? Well, Easter. What is Easter? It's the celebration of his resurrection. It's the celebration of this incredible demonstration of God's power, raising him from the dead. But of course, when does God show up? When he's in the grave. In his darkest hour, God shows up. You see, over and over again, we see in this passage that God comes for us in our darkest hour. So I want to encourage you, don't be afraid of dark times. Don't be afraid when times get hard, because those are the times when God comes for his people. God comes in our darkest hour. Okay, but what happens, right? What happens when Isaiah encounters God? And then for us, what does that mean for us? What should we expect when we encounter God? And what we discover in this passage about what happens when you come to encounter the presence of God is simply this. An encounter with God is the ultimate reality check. Right? I mean, it's the ultimate reality check because you're coming into contact with ultimate reality. How many of us have ever had a reality check? I remember when I was living in Boston, and I was the music director for a church right in the center of Boston, and our church met just a few blocks from the Berklee College of Music, which if you want to become a rock star, and your YouTube channel, it's not happening through your YouTube channel, you go to the Berklee College of Music. People from all around the world come, and that's where you go if you want to make it as a rock star. I mean, just in the 2 years that I was there, the worship band that I led at the Berklee College of Music, in subsequent history, one of the members won a Grammy for playing with Beyonce. Another guy, he told me, Kevin, I have to quit the band because I have to leave the church because I'm in a band. And a month later, I saw him on the Tonight Show. One of the keyboard players became an arranger for American Idol. Another guy has been touring around with many of the major Christian artists. Like this is the place to go if you want to become a rock star. But here's the thing. For many of the kids who came there, it was a reality check. I mean, I saw time and time again kids that, they were like a local celebrity in Kansas. They were a local celebrity, maybe even in Denver. They were a local celebrity wherever they were. And then they came to the Berklee College of Music, and they realized they were a dime a dozen. They realized that all around them there were musicians just as good as them, if not better. It was very humbling. It was a reality check. I mentioned to you that there was a time in my life when I believed a powerful and transcendent myth that I was an incredible ultimate Frisbee player. But when I started to play with people my own age, I was humbled. It was a reality check. Any of you ever had that sort of an experience, a humbling reality check? You see, what Isaiah shows us is that if you come to encounter the presence of God, you will have the ultimate reality check. That's what we discover here. It's almost like when he meets God, it's too much for him to handle. You notice this? Okay, again, looking in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. You notice that he says he sees God, and then he starts talking about the train of his robe. He starts talking about what covers his feet. Well, why is this? Well, most commentators will say because he's afraid to look above his feet. Like the presence of God is too real, it's too powerful. He can't even lift his gaze to see God, so he just looks at his feet. And then in the next verse, right, it says, above God, he looks above God, it says, above him stood the seraphim, these angelic creatures. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Right, so you get this picture of this angelic creature, this seraphim, who's got 6 wings. With 2 of the wings, he's covering his face. Why is he covering his face? Because the reality of God is too powerful even for this angelic creature. And then with 2 of the other wings, he's covering his feet. Why? Because he's ashamed to be in the presence of ultimate reality. So of his 6 wings, he's got 2 covering his eyes. He's got 2 covering his feet. I imagine that the other 2 wings are just flapping like crazy, just trying to keep him in the air, like when a B-17's only got 2 engines. I mean, this poor little creature just trying to stay up in the air. You see, the reality of God is almost too much for us to handle. If you come into a genuine encounter with the presence of God, it is an ultimate reality check. Now, what is the cash value of this reality check? Well, there are a number of ways in which we can express this, but I think what we see in the passage Isaiah here, one way of putting it is simply this. When you encounter God, you will in one way or another realize that your life is headed in the wrong direction. You encounter the presence of God, and it's a genuine encounter with God. You will come to realize that your life is headed in the wrong direction. It's sort of a disorienting experience. Actually, it's a reorienting experience, but it will feel disorienting, right? A little bit like you show up to a meeting at work and you discover that the meeting's already going. You thought you got there 5 minutes early and they've been going for like 15 minutes. And then you discover that your watch is 15 minutes slow. And so you have a reality check, right? Things have been off. Or maybe you've... Or maybe you're like Arthur in on Arthur's Christmas, and he's going out to deliver a present. This is Santa's son, Arthur, if you didn't know Santa had a son named Arthur. He's going out to deliver a present, and he's going to Trelew, England, and he's got to deliver this present to this poor kid that didn't get it on Christmas Day. And so he's trying to get it there to this kid in Trelew, England, and when he gets there, finally gets to his house, he discovers that the family, they all speak Spanish. And then he realizes he's not in Trelew, England. He's in Trelew, Spain, right? All of a sudden, there's this reorienting. He realizes he's been going in the wrong direction. You see, if you have a genuine encounter with God, that's what will happen. You'll come to realize that in one way or another, you are headed in the wrong direction. Of course, this is exactly what we see in Isaiah's response. Verse 5. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Notice this, the first thing he says is, I am lost. You see, he didn't realize he was lost until he was found. He didn't realize he was lost until God found him. But when God found him, then he realized that he was lost. What's interesting is that it seems that up until this point in Isaiah's life, Isaiah had been very aware of the lostness of other people. But he wasn't aware of his own lostness. You see, this passage does not come at the beginning of Isaiah. It's in chapter 6. And if you go back and you read chapters 1 through 5, what you discover is that Isaiah is already living as a prophet. He's already speaking, as it were, on behalf of God. But you know what he's doing? He's just calling out everybody else for their lostness. He's calling out the nation of Judah. He calls out Samaria. Really, he ends up calling out the entire world. The entire world is lost. The entire world is headed in the wrong direction. But then here he realizes, wait, so is he. I think that's an important lesson for those of us who call ourselves believers, because this scene here isn't just for unbelievers. We tend to think of a story like this. Oh, right, all those lost people, all those irreligious lost people out there. And we're very good at pointing the finger at how they do everything wrong, and they're the ones that are lost and going in the wrong direction. But you see, Isaiah made the same mistake. And when he came to encounter the presence of God, then he starts by pointing the finger at himself. He still goes on, says, I live amongst a people of unclean lips. He realizes everybody else is lost, but he pauses for a moment and starts with himself. You see, if you have a genuine encounter with the power of the presence of God, the first thing you will be aware of is your own lostness. Another way of saying this is this. When we encounter God, we become aware of our sin. So be careful what you wish for. I hear people all the time saying, Pastor, I want to know God. I really want to encounter the power and the presence of God. Well, be careful what you wish for. Because if you have a genuine encounter with God, you know what it's going to do? It's going to reveal your own sin. It's going to reveal the way in which you've turned from God. You know, this is why I think Lent is probably the least popular season in the life of the church. I mean, many people kind of practice it. It's got a history, but I don't think anybody gets real excited about it. Because it's a season that if we properly understand it, it's designed to encourage us to reflect upon our own sin. It's to encourage us to repent. It's to encourage us to look at our life and our circumstances and to ask ourselves, the challenges and the difficulties that I'm facing, is it possible that some of it might be my fault? Is it possible that I'm living in a way that is contributing to the brokenness that I'm experiencing in my life? You see, it's almost the opposite of this season of Advent. You see, in the season of Advent, as we saw when we looked in the book of Habakkuk, that's a season in which I encouraged you to look at the challenges and the difficulties and the hardships in your life in this world and to point the finger at God and say, God, where are you in the midst of this? That's what the book of Habakkuk is all about. Habakkuk cries out, points the finger at God. We like that, right? We like that season. Yeah, you mean I can just let God have it? Look at all the challenges I'm facing and say, God, where are you? Why aren't you fixing things? Well, friends, I was just setting you up for Lent. Because now it's time to look at ourselves and realize maybe it's not God's fault, the circumstances that we're in. Maybe it's our own sin. You see, when you have a genuine encounter with the presence of God, it will reveal to you your own lostness, will reveal to you your own sin. So, get fired up. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be looking at our own lostness. We're going to be looking at our own sin. I guess I could end it right there. Leave you on that sobering note. But that's not where this passage leaves us. And so I won't leave you there either. Notice what emerges immediately after Isaiah acknowledges his sin. Notice what it says. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Now, there's a lot of scholarly debate about what coal this is, and when he brings the coal to his lips, how this, what this represented, or what this actually came out of, what was this coal, this sort of thing. And there's a lot of debates about that, but the central point is abundantly clear. So don't get distracted. The central point is simply this. At the very moment we become aware of our sin, God's grace abounds. At the very moment in which we are confronted with the reality of our sin, he takes that away. He takes our guilt away. The coal burns it away, removes it from us. You see, this whole season of Lent is not one that's intended to leave you in despair. It's to lead you to the grace of God. It's to lead you to the hope that is found in the reality that we have a God who loves us when we are honest about our sin, who forgives us when we confess the ways in which we have been going in the wrong direction. In fact, I would suggest to you that this is what Christian maturity is all about. Christian maturity is about growing in an awareness of our own sin. And in so doing, we become more and more aware of the grace of God. Look at this chart here. This, I believe, points well to the reality of the Christian journey. You'll notice here, before the point of conversion, before a person comes to know God, they're not really even aware of their sin. They don't really get it. But see, when you have that encounter with God, all of a sudden you become aware of his holiness and you become aware of your own sin. And I would suggest that the more you grow in your faith, the more you will become aware of God's holiness, and the more you will become aware of your sin. But then notice this. You'll notice that much more what God has done for you in Jesus. What is going on here? This coal that takes away the guilt. We know it's symbolic. A coal doesn't take away your sin. This is a religious symbol that is pointing to a reality that is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Ultimately, how can God forgive us of our sin? By taking it upon himself. That's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is just taking the weight of somebody's offense upon yourself and saying, I won't retaliate. I won't give you what you deserve. I'll just take it. I'll just absorb it. And on the cross, Jesus said, I will take your sin, no matter how bad it is, no matter how heavy the weight is, even if it's so bad that it kills me. That's the reality of the grace of God. And maturity, Christian maturity is becoming more and more aware of God's holiness and more aware of your own sin. But in that, you begin to appreciate more and more and more the grace of God. Friends, my hope is that this season we will grow in our appreciation of the grace of God. And you know what will happen if that happens in your life? You will pivot. You'll make changes in your life. Notice how Isaiah responds to this gracious act of forgiveness. Actually, God speaks to him and says this, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. Notice that God doesn't force him to follow him. He doesn't force him into obedience. There's an invitation here. He asks a question. He invites him. And Isaiah, because he's come to experience the power of the presence of God, because he's come to experience the holiness of God, because he has been reoriented, though it felt very disorienting, and though he has been convicted of his sin, he has come to see God's love for him. That he is reconciled to God, that he is free of that sin. And so he responds, I would suggest with jubilance. He says, here I am, send me. There's no compulsion. It's an invitation to pivot. Friends, my prayer is that this season would be a season in which we, as we experience the power of the grace of God, it might compel us to make changes in our lives. I would encourage you to be open to that. Be open throughout this season to the ways in which God might be saying, you need to make a change here. You need to make a change in which you're thinking about this. You need to make a change in the way you're living in this area. You need to change in the way you're treating so-and-so. As we experience the grace of God, may we make those changes in our lives that are ultimately better for us and give glory to God. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity to pivot.